begrüße alle herzlich zu dem Oben, wo im Thema israelisch-palästinensischer Friedensprozess, Past Realities and Future Possibilities gewidmet ist. Ich danke Lior Lehrs, dass zu uns nach Zürich und Basel gekommen ist. Lior Lehrs is a lecturer at the Swiss Center for Conflict Research at the Hebrew University and also lecturer at the Department of International Relations. His colleague and source of inspiration was Yaakov Bar Simantov, as far as I understand, who founded this Swiss Center at the Hebrew University, Swiss Center for Conflict Research, Management and Resolution. Bar Simantov has been several times to Basel and Zurich, and I knew him quite well. He passed away quite young, unfortunately. Dr. Lehrs has written a book on private peace initiatives, which is very interesting. It's published by Manchester University Press. His research encompasses conflicts in Northern Ireland, in Cyprus, and in Israel, and many more locations. Right now, we are really living difficult times, strange times. It started with October 7, where we were shocked about this attack of Hamas against the kibbutzim, Asa, Kibbutz Be'eri, Alumim, cities like Sderot and Ofakim, which I visited, and also the Nova. Now it's a memorial place, actually. And we were shocked about this attack. It's called the Gaza envelope now, Gaza Gürtel. Since then, a lot happened, a lot changed. And today, again, we are overwhelmed by the news. This morning, we heard that rebels, we don't know, it's a combination of Islamists, Kurds, who actually arrived at Damascus. And it's quite, we don't know what the future will bring. Israel has to defend the borders towards Syria. Actually, a few days ago, there was this truce with Lebanon, between Israel and Lebanon, and it relieved us a little bit. And we thought maybe eventually the population, the 60,000 people who have evacuated from the north of Israel, could go back. But we don't know exactly what's going to happen. There are still about 100 hostages in Gaza, and we found out yesterday that one seems to be alive, which is wonderful, but of the locations of the others, we don't know that much, unfortunately. The moderation of the evening today will be done by Netta Ahituv. Netta Ahituv is a journalist of Haaretz. She writes a lot now for the magazine of Haaretz, for the weekend magazine. And Netta moved to Basel with her family a few months ago, and we are very happy about that, actually. So Netta will lead the moderation. Netta is not only a journalist, she's also involved in many events or many panels, and she is active in the Bucerius Zeitstiftung, which holds panels twice a year, if I understand well, in Hamburg and in another place. So we are truly looking forward to your moderation. Now I can pass the microphone and the stage to Lior Lehrs. Thank you very much.
So hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank all of you for coming. And first, I want to thank the Swiss Friends of the Hebrew University, especially Nadia, for inviting me. Also to thank Edna and Netta for being part of this event and for all the work organizing all of this. And I know that talking about Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking during these days is a little bit like science fiction, but today I would like to take you to a journey to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, past realities and future possibilities. And actually, my presentation will have 4 parts. As you can see here, I will start with the background leading to the emergence of the peace process, end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. And then I will talk about the Oslo Accords, the Oslo Agreements, the Oslo process. And then I will talk about the 2 main efforts that we had to try to reach what we call the final status agreement, the comprehensive agreement. The first one is in 2000, what we call the Camp David process. And then, of course, the collapse of the talks, then the second Intifada. And the second is in 2008, the Annapolis process. And then I will say a few words about the stalemate in the process that we had since then. And then we can also connect it to discussion about the future and the day after also in the discussion. Now, I will start with a few words about the main factors and development leading to the beginning of the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. And we can start actually with the end of '87, with the first Intifada, the eruption of the first Intifada. So it taking place 20 years after Israel took control over West Bank and Gaza. And it actually started the Intifada in Gaza, moving to East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and continued for a few years. And I'm mentioning it because it really had a dramatic impact on the conflict. It really reshaped the landscape of the conflict and had a lot of important developments that eventually led to the process. I will mention some of them. First of all, in July '88, and this is important, the Jordanian king, King Hussein, if you remember, declared that Jordan is disengaging from the West Bank. And probably you know that Jordan controlled the West Bank until '67. And for many years after that, we talked about what we call the Jordanian option, that if there will be a solution for the West Bank, it will be in a negotiation between Israel and Jordan. Jordan can speak in the name of the Palestinians. So that was the main option over the years. But at some point, we will have a new actor in the scene, and this is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that got more and more public support and public legitimacy, local and international. And during these years, Jordan lost the legitimacy to speak in the name of the Palestinian, and now you have a new actor, the PLO. And in '88, that was a peak moment that Jordan said, you don't have the Jordanian option anymore. You need to talk with the Palestinian. We are out of the picture. Maybe just some involvement in Jerusalem, but other than that, we are not part of it. And then there was another important event, a short time after that the PLO had an important meeting in Algeria, declaring for the first time that their official position is the 2-state solution. That this is the PLO platform. This is from now on the new position of the PLO. And again, it's a very dramatic change because, as you know, the original position of the PLO was from the river to the sea, one Palestinian state. That was in the beginning, in the '60s. But there was an internal debate inside the PLO between different groups and different camps. And I worked a lot on it a little bit in my PhD. And it was very difficult. But eventually, it took time. But in '88, that was the moment that they declared that they are moving, changing their position and moving to support the 2-state solution, and also focusing not on the military strategy, but more on the political strategy. And again, it took a while. And then a month after that, PLO and Arafat, that was the main leader of the PLO, did another step. And they actually accepted all the 3 conditions that the international community asked the PLO for many, many years. If you want to be part of the peace process, you need to accept 3 conditions. One is to accept the idea of the 2-state solution, that it means the existence of Israel. 2 is the UN Resolution 242 that maybe you heard about, that means land for peace, and denouncing terrorism. And in '88, Arafat declared that they accept the 3 conditions, leading for the first time to dialogue between the US and the PLO, but not with Israel. At this point, Israel still refused to talk with the PLO, consider them as a terrorist organization. But I can say that during these years of the Intifada, again, it continued until the early '90s, we saw changes in the Israeli public opinion that started to ask more and more questions about the West Bank, about the Palestinian. And nobody talked about it before that. If you remember, in the '80s, the focus was about Lebanon or other issues. So it started to ask questions and challenge that, and also the idea of a negotiation with the Palestinians started to rise. But then it took a few more years in order to get to real negotiation. And if you remember, the early '90s was a very positive and optimistic years when we had the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that was actually a trigger for many peacemaking around the world. I'm dealing with conflicts in different places. You can see actually the beginning of peace processes in Latin America, in Africa, in Northern Ireland, and also in the Middle East. And I also want to mention, if you remember the first Gulf War in 91, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and then you had an international coalition against him. And why this is relevant? Because first of all, in this war, it was not a war between Israel and the Arabs, as we saw all over the years, 48, 56, 67, and so on. It was a war that you have a different camps. Israel was actually in the same side with most of the Arab countries. So we saw that the boundaries in the Middle East started to change. Something like we see today when Israel and Arab countries versus Iran, for example. It was also relevant because Arafat actually did a big mistake at this point, decided to support Iraq, Saddam Hussein. And it led to a very deep isolation of the PLO around the world, and especially the Gulf state, the Saudis, that gave a lot of support for the PLO, decided to stop the support, the political support, economic support, expelling also a lot of Palestinians that used to work in the Gulf state. And that was a big crisis for the PLO. And they got into another crisis because for the first time, the PLO, again, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, found themselves in a competition with another Palestinian group that is trying to challenge them. And that was not the case before the first Intifada. But 87, 88, 89, we have a new actor that now, of course, we all know, and this is Hamas organization that was created really at the beginning of the Intifada, and started to challenge the PLO and also to criticize the PLO for their position on the two-state solution. And that was also a big problem for the PLO. Without getting to details about PLO and Hamas, and this is, I think, very relevant until today, I will say 2 points. First, Hamas is, of course, a much more religious organization. Religious in their platform, religious in their activities, religious in their rhetoric, much more than the PLO. This is the first thing. We can also see the way that they are talking about the conflict is much more religious. In the charter that they published at the beginning of the Intifada, they're saying it's actually a religious conflict against the Jews, and also talking about jihad and talking about Holy Land. So their words are very, very religious. While the PLO at the same time is actually moving to talk about two-state solution, saying it's a political conflict that can be negotiated. So you can see the gap between these two organizations. And I'm saying that because it actually pushed the PLO to think more about the political process with Israel in order to get some achievement. Because we are isolated, we don't have the support that we used to have. We have this competition with Hamas. The only way we can get some achievement to the public is maybe through a political process. And at the same time, also on the Israeli side, the fact that you have this Hamas that started to act, started to work, and also to start terrorist activities, pushed a lot of Israeli decision makers to think, okay, we have a problem with the PLO, but with them, maybe we can do business. Otherwise, we will find ourselves with Hamas, that with them, it's only a religious conflict. And Shimon Peres, that was one of the labor leaders, later will lead part of Oslo, he always said, I don't love PLO, but when I see the alternative Hamas, I become romantic, because I see that it's a question of options eventually in conflict and in the Middle East. So it actually pushed both parties to think about negotiation. And then we have another historic event in 91 when the Madrid conference, when actually all the parties came together for the first time with the US administration, James Baker, and started negotiation, Israeli and Palestinian, Israeli and Jordanian, Israeli and Syrian, Israeli and Lebanese. So that was the first step. There was not a lot of progress in this negotiation. It's still Shamir government, but that was the first step. And eventually there was another important event, and this is, of course, a political change in Israel in 92, when Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, the leader of Labour, became the prime minister and had a big victory. Now, as you probably know, Rabin had a long military background. He was the chief of staff during the 67 war, the Six-Day War. He was the Ministry of Defense. So he was very popular at that point, mainly also because of his security background. In the election, he promised to bring an agreement with the Palestinians about an autonomy in the first year. That was his promise in the election. And we actually saw that during 93, the parties, for the first time in the history, met in Oslo. Actually, a fascinating story, the secret back channel. There are some movies about it. It started as a secret back channel leading to an agreement, and you can see here the parties signing this agreement. Now, by the way, it was signed in the White House, even though the American had no idea about, no involvement in the process. It was mainly Israeli and Palestinian, some facilitation of the Norwegian, but not the US, but eventually it was signed in the White House. And again, because I'm dealing with conflict and conflict resolution, that was really a remarkable moment when you have two parties, two actors that refuse to recognize the other side. The PLO said that they want the destruction of Israel. Israel said that PLO is the worst enemy, it's the worst, and refused to talk with them. And then after 20 years, we have this process that they are sitting together and at least start to talk. It's not the peace agreement, but at least it's the first step. So this was a really remarkable stage. Now, a few words about Oslo. And as you all know, Oslo became a very controversial term, both Israeli side and the Palestinian side, a lot of criticism. But let's say a few words about what exactly we saw in this agreement. And we need to remember we're talking about 6 agreements, not just one. But I will start with the first Oslo Accord, September 93. And actually, I think that maybe one of the most important elements that we had in this agreement was a few days before the agreement. And this is what we call a mutual recognition document between Israel and the PLO. It was actually exchange of letters between Rabin and Arafat. For the first time, the PLO officially, in an official letter of the PLO, recognized Israel, and not just recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security. And in exchange, Rabin recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. So that was the first step. I can also say, talking about Israel's legitimacy and international status, that the fact that the PLO and Arafat recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security was very important, because many regional actors said, we are not going to be holier than the Pope. If the Palestinian and Arafat recognize Israel, we can also start talking with them. So that also changed the regional status of Israel. I will get to it. Now, the whole idea of Oslo was based on the idea of 2 stages, that it's going to be a gradual process. By the way, they actually copied it from the Camp David agreement between Israel and Egypt. This idea came from there with Begin and Sadat. The idea is that this is one of the most complicated conflicts, what we call intractable conflict, dealing with history, dealing with identity, the most complicated issue, Jerusalem, refugees. We can resolve it right away. We just started to know each other and to talk. We can have a comprehensive agreement. So we need 2 stages. So the Oslo Accord was not a peace agreement. It was what we call an interim agreement. It was a temporary agreement for 5 years. It was supposed to be until 1999, only until then, and then we'll move to the next stage. So the first stage is to create mainly the Palestinian Authority, that was not exist before, to start the cooperation. And during these 5 years, we will negotiate what we call the final status agreement, actually dealing with the main core issues of the conflict. In the first stage, we are not dealing with that. Settlement, Jerusalem, refugees, let's postpone it. We will deal with it in the next stage. And until 1999, we need to have the final status agreement. And that didn't happen, as you know. So we found ourselves in a temporary agreement that continued, instead of 5 years, it's more than 30 years. And we are not able to move forward to a final status agreement, but also nobody wants to cancel this agreement. So we are actually stuck in this framework. So just briefly, first of all, we saw as part of the implementation, the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Again, until then, it was only the Israeli military civil administration control. It started in Gaza and Jericho, the creation of the Palestinian police in specific areas, and I will show the map. Also the security cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian forces, and transferring responsibility, again, from the military, the civil administration, to the Palestinian Authority about the civil aspect. Education, economy, everything related to religion, and so on. So that was the first. Now you're responsible for the Palestinian in this area on the civil aspect. And another very important outcome that we need to remember of Oslo was the second peace agreement we had Israel with an Arab country. The first one is Egypt. The second is between Israel and Jordan. You can see here Rabin and Hussein. And we need to say that Jordan wanted to sign a peace agreement with Israel for many, many years, King Hussein. But he felt that he had no legitimacy in his home, the domestic, in Jordan, but also in the region. Only after Arafat signed this agreement and he felt that the Israelis and Palestine are moving toward peace, only then he said, now I can do this peace that I wanted to do for many years. And they knew each other, by the way, for 20 years. And I think that in the last year, we saw the importance of the cooperation with Jordan, that usually it's a secret security cooperation, but when we had the attacks coming from Iran with the rockets twice, we saw the importance of the creation of Jordan as a buffer zone that can prevent attack from Jordan. And you can see that that was the first thing we're being raised in the negotiation with King Hussein. Let's talk about how you can help us prevent attack. They thought about Iraq and Iran. So you can see how much the peace agreement is an important part in the security policy, also thinking about Israel in the region. And we also had other normalization steps during these years with other countries, the Gulf state and the North Africa that started in these years. And in the end of 95, actually 1 month before Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, they signed another agreement, what we call the Oslo II, that created a new map in the West Bank, and I will show it to you. And this is, again, the map until today, when it's supposed to be just for 5 years. And I can say that I interviewed people that were part of the negotiation on the map, and they said, we thought it's only for a few months, maybe 2 years, it's not really important. Anyway, we are going to talk about the final status. But this map continued and stayed for 30 years until today, more or less. So what are we seeing here? We see 3 types of zone. Area A is what you can see in green. It's actually the Palestinian cities. When, according to the agreement, it means full Palestinian control, security, and civil control, according to the agreement. The area with orange is actually Palestinian villages, again in 1995, when it's area B, that it means that you have security, Israeli control, and civil Palestinian control. Again, it changes over the years, but this is the main idea. And all the West, that it's actually 60% of the West Bank, most of the West Bank, it's full Israeli control, what we call Area C. When you have all the settlement there, you have also military bases. And again, the idea was we will negotiate all of these areas in the next stage. That's supposed to be just a temporary. About Gaza, I will just mention that the Palestinian Authority controls most of the Gaza Strip, but not all of it. Because, as you know, there was settlement in the Gaza Strip in different parts that, according to Oslo, nobody is going to remove the settlement. Again, settlement, we'll talk about it in the next stage, in the final status. So it was important for Rabin and Peres for the public legitimacy to say, I'm not removing any settlement in this process. This is for the next stage. So all the settlements stayed where they are. And it, of course, created a lot of challenges because you have the Tsarim, for example, that you can see in the middle of 2 million Palestinians, but it was still there. You need to find some ways to live with it between the Palestinian Authority and the settlement, but it was not removed as part of Oslo. According to Oslo, you don't need to remove the settlement. Of course, the Palestinian public opinion saw it differently, and I will get to it. And just the last important point in this agreement is that for the first time, we have an election in the Palestinian Authority. So we have an election for the Palestinian president and election for the Palestinian Council, and Yasser Arafat had a big victory, and also his movement, Fatah. Important to say that Hamas did not participate in this election. Hamas was completely against the Oslo process, I will mention that in a minute, and did not participate because participate in the election, it means we are giving legitimacy to the Oslo process and the two-state and recognition in Israel. We are not going to do it. So they did not participate in this election. We know that 10 years after that, they changed their mind. But here, there was a big victory for Arafat. Now, I mentioned Hamas, and an important concept that we have in the literature about conflict and peacemaking is what we call the peace spoilers. And this is something we can see in many conflicts, not just in the Middle East, when you have organization or actors that really see the peacemaking or peace agreement as the biggest threat for them, that they will try to do whatever they can to stop or to prevent the process from continuing. Of course, using violence. And many scholars actually use the Oslo process as a good example for the work of the peace spoilers on both sides. When first of all, of course, we had Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad is a more small organization that is very strongly connected to Iran, but sometimes Hamas and Islamic Jihad work together, conducted a terrorist attack inside Israel in different cities, suicide bombing, I mentioned some example during this year of Oslo, 94 in Tel Aviv, Dizengoff, 95 in Bet Lid. In 96, actually, there was 2 attacks in 1 week in the same bus, in the same number, bus number 18, and that was actually my bus to school. I was living in Jerusalem back then, so I remember it very, very good. And that was a very difficult moment, and it also had a negative impact on the Israeli public opinion that started to lose faith in this process, feeling that we are not getting security. At the same time, we had also Israeli supporters that wanted to stop the process. The 2 most famous events we have, the Hebron massacre, took place short time after the Oslo agreement was signed. February 94, Baruch Goldstein, that was a religious extremist from Kiryat Arba, entered into the holy sites in Hebron, the cave of the patriarch, the mosque Ibrahim, and started shooting and killed a lot of Palestinians with a clear goal to stop the process. And he said that to many of his friends before that's his goal. And of course, November 95, Rabin, the prime minister, was murdered after a big demonstration supporting the peace in Tel Aviv by, again, Yigal Amir, a religious extremist that wanted to stop the peace process. So we saw the war of the spoilers on both sides that had a lot of impact on the process. Just to complete the 90s, I would say that a year after that, we had an election. And this time it was Netanyahu running for the first time, by the way, against Peres, that was the deputy of Rabin. It was very, very close. But eventually, Netanyahu won, and the terrorist attack in 96 had a lot of influence on the public opinion, and many people voted for Netanyahu because of that. And Netanyahu was against Oslo all the time, led the campaign against Oslo, but he felt he was enforced for different reasons to continue with the process, but it was already a different kind of process, very slowly moving from one crisis to another, even though he signed 2 agreements with the PLO, the Hebron Agreement and the Y Agreement. But I would say that the main source of tension that we saw already then, and of course since then, is the question of the settlement. When there was nothing in the agreement about settlement, and Israel, according to Oslo, not only in the next stage we'll talk about it. And actually during these years, you can see here the data, you saw the expansion of the settlement during Oslo. So if I mention the Israeli public opinion, here we can see that the Palestinian public opinion started to ask questions. We are talking about the Palestinian 2-state, and how come we have suddenly more and more settlement, more and more settlers, also losing faith in the process because of that. So we saw how the process a little bit get weak because of that. Now I mentioned that the deadline for reaching a final status agreement is 99, but it didn't happen, as we all know. And actually the negotiation started only after 99. And in order to get to that, we had another political change. You can see here Ehud Barak that had a big victory. He was running against Netanyahu. Netanyahu lost. Ehud Barak, the head of labor, had a big victory. By the way, there is a trend. He was a chief of staff of the army. He left the army and then he won against Netanyahu. This is a trend, by the way. You see the chief of staff leaving the army and then running against Netanyahu. There is a complex relation here. And he had a big victory, and he promised to bring peace with the Palestinian in his election campaign. And for the first time in 2000, for the first time in the history, Israelis and Palestinians met in different parts of the world to have negotiation on the most complicated questions: Jerusalem, refugees, the border, the settlement, the security. And in July 2000, Clinton decided to bring the parties to meet in Camp David, as Carter did with Begin and Sadat. And by the way, Barak was very pushing to do this summit because he wanted one moment that it would be decided, and Arafat was actually against it, but eventually he agreed to come. And as we all know, it failed. They couldn't reach an agreement in Camp David. And of course, there are many discussion and narratives about what happened. I can say I interviewed most of the people that were in Camp David. My main conclusion is that the question of Jerusalem eventually was the main obstacle, and more specifically, the most contested site, the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, Har HaBayit, Al-Aqsa compound. That was the main problem, the sovereignty. So they couldn't find an agreement for that. And there was also a lot of problem in the way the negotiation was conducted. There was a lot of studies on that. But the negotiation continued. It didn't stop. It actually continued until the end of the year. But as we all know, in September 2000, we have another explosion. The trigger was the visit of Ariel Sharon, the head of the opposition, to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, then immediately leading to riots and protests and violence that started to escalate. But I would say that the peak moment and the escalation came a little bit later, in 2001, when we saw the terrorist attack in Israel. At this moment, it was still under control, and the negotiation continued. And I would just mention that President Clinton, that I think was the most American president committed to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, more than all the other, that until the last days, you can see at the end of December 2000, he was about to leave the White House. He said, okay, I will try just the last-minute effort. And then he presented the Clinton plan. That you can all Google it. It's, I think, one of the most important documents that we have, really trying to say that can be a basis for an agreement. But we know it was probably too late. It did not lead to a breakthrough, even though it was a very serious effort. And that was actually the end of the negotiation. In the beginning of 2001, we have another election. Ariel Sharon, the head of the Likud, won this election. Barak lost. And during these years, we just had escalation, terrible years with terrible terrorist attack in Israel, military operation in the West Bank, in Gaza, when it seems that all of the structure of Oslo is actually collapsing. And of course, during all of Sharon years, there was no final status talks. There was no peace negotiation during these years. And I think this is important if you are trying to understand the mind of the Israelis and Palestinians, especially the post-Oslo generation. We need to understand that that was a critical moment, that many people said, okay, we tried, it failed, there is no hope. And until today, you can see also in the survey, in the public opinion, that really changed the political map on both sides. So because of that, to complete this point, I would like to talk a little bit about how the two sides see this failure. Now, of course, both sides agree that it failed, but you have very different narratives of how each side can explain this failure, the collapse of the process. So again, without getting to right or wrong, just the main argument that I think it's a consensus on both sides. On the Israeli narrative, the main argument is that we wanted security. That's the reason we did Oslo, and we didn't get it. It was not achieved. The public just lost trust because of the violence and the terror. Another important argument is that Arafat couldn't do this transformation from being a terrorist to a statesman, was always ambivalent toward violence, and also that he never tried to prepare the public for peace, like Sadat did with Egypt, for example. About Camp David, the main narrative that you will hear, I think, from most of the Israelis is that we discovered there is no partner for peace. Again, whether it's right or wrong, this is what most of the people conclusion, and also that Palestinians missed the opportunity and we gave them a good offer, and claiming that even Clinton blamed Arafat. I just saw that in the last week he said that again. But on the Palestinian narrative, of course, it's like a mirror image in their opinion. So first of all, you can see that they said the goal of Oslo was independence. This is why we joined Oslo, we took part of Oslo, we wanted the state, and we didn't get it. We just got a different kind of occupation. That's something that's just more far from the idea of a state. And also an argument on the Palestinian side was during Oslo, we saw more and more expansion of settlement, moving from 100,000 to more than 500,000, land confiscation, closure, and checkpoints. Now, of course, the counter-argument from the Israeli side is that the checkpoint is because of the terrorist attack, because of security problem, but from the Palestinian point of view, they saw less and less freedom of movement during Oslo, so that's what they remember. And there were also a lot of promises in Oslo about an airport, about the safe passage between Gaza and the West Bank. It's supposed to be one entity, and also redeployment of forces, and it didn't happen. Some of it, by the way, started in 1999-2000, but it all collapsed. About Camp David, the main Palestinian argument is that the Clinton offer was actually unacceptable. It was not something that they can accept, especially on Jerusalem, especially on the holy site. And they felt a lot of pressure, that Israelis and the Americans are putting pressure on them. And they claim that they also made a lot of far-reaching compromises and a lot of concessions, and that also the US actually did not really play the role of the honest broker in this process. So again, you can see different explanation, different way they see the same event, but in both sides, we can see that it really had a dramatic impact. Just to emphasize and to illustrate, especially on the Israeli side, you can see here, this is from the survey of what we call Peace Index, Madad HaShalom. that is actually asking every month since the 90s. And you can see here that in around mid-99, there was almost 60% of the Israeli public support Oslo and believe that Oslo can bring peace. And that was after Barak was elected, by the way. And we can look in July 2002, and that was after in March 2002 was the most terrible months in the Intifada, many terrorist attacks, and the Passover and all of this. It got to less than 20% of the people believe Oslo can bring peace. So again, and we had ups and downs since then, but you can see how much these events and doing this year, and again on both sides, had a very important impact in order to understand the public opinion and political map until today. Now, just the last part, I would like to mention that there was still another effort to reach the final status agreement, even though it failed and even though we found ourselves in this escalation. But it took a few years until we get there, and that was in 2007 and 2008 in the Annapolis process, when we had Olmert and Abu Mazen. And again, during the Intifada, there was no negotiation, just trying to de-escalate the situation. There were two main developments that eventually led to the, again, renewal of the negotiation. The first one was the political change that took place on both sides. On the Palestinian side, Arafat died and Abu Mazen replaced him in 2005. And he was elected as a president in another election in the Palestinian Authority. And by the way, Hamas also did not participate in this election, just for the president. And Abu Mazen, by the way, we need to say, has always a different policy about violence comparing to Arafat. And he was always against the Second Intifada. He was always against using violence. And he said it very clearly during the Second Intifada. He supported the cooperation, security cooperation with Israel. And Olmert, of course, replaced Sharon in 2006. And he also had more support in the idea of negotiation comparing to Sharon. But of course, there was another dramatic development that it's very relevant for what's going on today, and this is about Gaza. When Sharon, again, the Prime Minister Sharon, decided in 2005 to have the disengagement from Gaza and to remove all the settlement, all the settlers in Gaza. But it was in a unilateral step. It was not part of any negotiation or an agreement or peace process. And that was very important for Sharon to say, this is an Israeli step, we are not talking with you, we are not asking you. It's only what is good for us. And that's also the way it was perceived in the public, that this is a unilateral step. And we can see that in 2006, they had another Palestinian election. By the way, President Bush, as part of his campaign to bring democracy to the Middle East, was very pushing the Palestinians to do the election. And this time, Hamas decided to participate in the election for the first time, even though it's Oslo and all of this. And they actually won this election, and that was a surprise. But there are two main reasons that actually very helpful for them. First of all, the disengagement was seen on the Palestinian side as a victory for Hamas, because it was not part of negotiation, it was not part of the process, it was actually because of the violence we got the disengagement. So it was actually helpful for Hamas. The second thing was the corruption in the Palestinian Authority, that many of the people were voting against them, not because they were religious, but because of the corruption of the Fatah. So that's eventually what we had, the victory of Hamas. And it created a terrible crisis inside the Palestinian society between the president from one movement, the prime minister. And it actually led to a short civil war in June 2007 between Hamas and Fatah. And we saw the brutality of Hamas, by the way, throwing people from the Fatah from the roofs, if you remember that, in Gaza, and also shooting them on the knee. Some Palestinians from Fatah ran to the border with Israel that Israel would save them from Hamas. And eventually they took over of Gaza by force, Hamas. And since then we have these two, until the war, these two governments, one of the Abu Mazen in the PLO in Ramallah, in the West Bank, and the other one in Gaza of Hamas. And we have two Palestinian leadership. And actually this time it pushed the parties again to renew the negotiation. Again, Prime Minister Olmert and Abu Mazen started again negotiation on all the issues. And they actually met almost every 2 weeks between them, and also they had a lot of committees dealing with all the other issues. And the last point I would like to say about it, even though they didn't reach an agreement, Olmert resigned in 2008, and that was the end of the process, I would like to say briefly a few points about the points in agreement and points of disagreement between the parties on these 4 core issues. Again, that's the most important issues in the agreement. the first one doing the negotiation. The first one is about borders. And here, the parties agreed that there will be two states. There will be a Palestinian state side by side Israel, and there will be a withdrawal of Israel from most of the territories, but of course, some disagreement about the percentage. And both parties agreed to, if you heard about it, what we call the land swaps. It means that the border will be based on 67 border as it was in 67, what we call the green line, but it will not be exactly as it was because things change. So in some cases, we can add, for example, a settlement that it's very close to the border, and we can add it to Israel, and I'll show a map in a minute. But in exchange, you need to have empty areas inside Israel to the Palestinian. And then you can say that you got 100%, but it's not exactly as at the border as it was. And then they had a disagreement, of course, about the numbers. And many of the documents from the negotiation, by the way, were leaked by Al Jazeera. So it was very helpful for us as scholars, not very good for the process. So we have a lot of documents about the negotiation. We can see the maps. So here you can see the Israeli Olmert proposal. He was talking about 6% land swaps. You can see mainly adding to Israel settlement in Gush Etzion. You can see Jerusalem. You can see Ariel. This is the finger here in the West Bank. And of course, in exchange areas, empty areas in other places. But the Palestinian Abu Mazen was talking about 2%. So that was eventually the main disagreement, 6% and 2%. And you can see that in both cases, most of the settlers can actually stay where they are and will be annexed to Israel. But of course, you have differences in the number because most of the settlers actually live close to the border. There was another question about how to connect between the West Bank and Gaza. So that's also important. Already back then, Hamas controlled Gaza, but Abu Mazen said, one day I will go back and it will be part of us, and then we need to find a solution for that. Now, the question of Jerusalem, maybe one of the most complicated, sensitive issue, the parties agreed about the neighborhood, and this is what we call the Clinton formula. It means that the Arab neighborhood will be under Palestinian sovereignty, the Jewish neighborhood will be under Israeli sovereignty. But the main problem, again, about the holy sites, the old city, what we call the Holy Basin, and especially the most contested site, Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. And they couldn't reach an agreement about it. There are different creative ideas, by the way, like international sovereignty, divine sovereignty. We can say that sovereignty, God has sovereignty, and also horizontal division, that the Palestinian has sovereignty above, the Israeli has sovereignty. There are different ideas. All of them failed. Olmert, by the way, suggested a special regime in this area. And there was also the question of the border regime, if the city will be divided or it will keep it open as one city. Just about the refugees, and this is, again, Jerusalem, the refugees, the most sensitive, the most complicated issue because it relates to narrative, to history, to identity. But here, the parties agreed that there will be an international commission dealing with compensation, resettlement, rehabilitation of the refugees. And the Palestinian refugees will have 5 options. And by the way, we are talking mainly about the refugees in Lebanon and Syria. That's eventually the main issue. They can move to the new Palestinian state. They can move to this area in the land swaps that I mentioned. They can also stay where they are and get compensation and so on, or move into another country that will accept them. But the main disagreement was about option 5, that the Palestinians wanted that there will be also the option that some of them can go to Israel. And of course, Israel's position is completely against it, because the whole idea of 2 states, it means that Palestinians are not moving to Israel and Israelis are not moving to the Palestinian state. But Olmert agreed as a symbolic gesture, also part of family unification, to numbers like 5,000, 50,000 Palestinians that can come to Israel under, of course, consideration of Israel. And the Palestinians were talking about higher number. But that was also part of the disagreement about these numbers. Not the whole framework, but about the numbers. We also need to say that Israel demanded that also the question of the Jewish refugees that came from Arab and Muslim countries, Iraq, Morocco, Yemen, also this issue will be addressed in an agreement. The property that they lost, also the compensation, that also need to be addressed in an agreement. And I would just say on security that the parties agreed that there will be a demilitarized Palestinian state with clear limitation, and there will be some international presence. And Abu Mazen and Ulmer talk about NATO presence, especially in the borders, and also that was Abu Mazen agreed. And there will be special arrangement, especially in the Jordan Valley, because this is the border with Jordan. You need to make sure there are no weapon or smuggling, so that will be a cooperation with Jordan, and also security cooperation, intelligence sharing. So just for a conclusion, I will say a few words about since the end of the process, since the peace process collapsed. Actually, after this negotiation that was very serious and the parties made a lot of progress, you can hear, by the way, Ulmert and Abu Mazen always say, we just need a few more months. If we just had a few more months, I'm not sure. But then Netanyahu was elected, 2009. And actually, he is the prime minister almost all the time since then. There was a small break with Bennett and Lapid, but he's the prime minister since 2009. This is the Netanyahu years. And at the beginning, Obama administration tried to push again for renewed negotiation. He said, you're so close, we have just a different prime minister, but maybe let's try again. But it was clear that this is a different kind of negotiation. It was going nowhere. You can see in their faces how much they are happy to participate in this initiative. So it failed in different stages. And the last time that Israelis and Palestinians met to talk about peace was 2014. That was when John Kerry tried to bring the parties. And that's it. Since then, the last 10 years, we are in a full stalemate. After many, many years that we have always been some kind of negotiation or some kind, in the last 10 years, we are in a full stalemate. And as we can see, also the discussion in Israel about peacemaking or conflict resolution completely disappeared. Nobody's talking about it. There was just an article in Haaretz that also there are no songs about peace, even though we used to have even in the 50s, in the 60s, it's completely disappeared. And of course, moved to other topics. But during these years, we had many, many rounds of violence. Israel and Hamas in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, we were all the time had violence. And we only tried to do what we call the conflict management, try to manage the conflict in different ways. Also some arrangement with Hamas, sometimes that we don't know all the details about it. The only goal is to conflict management, not any long-term peacemaking. And also we can see that the support in the two-state solution was declining all over the years in two sides. This is until 2020. Of course, today it's lower. By the way, not necessarily they support one state, but decline in support in two-state. And just the last word I will say, and we can develop it more in the discussion, about the day after the war. And I would like to say that we are still, of course, not at the end of the war. And during this year, we saw diplomatic efforts trying to reach ceasefire with Lebanon, the ceasefire and the hostages, bringing them back into with Gaza. But there was another effort led by the Biden administration and regional actors to try to think about the day after, not just a ceasefire, try to change the whole political order in the region, to make sure it will not happen again and to move from the direction that we talked about the last year to a different direction. Something that will be a real change, not just another short agreement. And Biden was talking about connecting the issue of Gaza to the normalization between Israel and the Saudis. And then to create a new coalition in the region that the issue of Gaza and a new solution for Gaza without Hamas will be part of it. As we know, it failed, but I believe there will be still discussion on this option. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating. I know the whole history, and I've studied it, I've lived it, I'm writing about it, and still I was fascinated. So thank you. When you see it structured and in a timeline, it's a whole different story. So thank you so much for that. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nadia and the Hebrew University and Edna and everybody. Thank you. I think let's start with the current events so we could be more on, D-Day page. So obviously Syria is crazy development, crazy in the Middle East. And it's amazing how fast things change in the Middle East, like from one day to another. How do you think it will affect Israel? And if you haven't read the news, I'll just update that Israel, the IDF today kind of conquered, or I don't know, conquered, maybe it's a tough word, but is now present on the Syrian side of the Ramat HaGolan, of HaGolan and the Hermon mountain, and for the first time since 1974, since an agreement was signed between Israel and Syria. So now we have another piece of land. We have, like, I want to say Titkadshu, we have a new border. How do you think it will affect now that Assad is gone? It's one of the Iran, axis. Wow, what a change.
Yeah, so it's a big question. First, because I have the background of history of Middle East, I have to say a few things about the history of Syria. And you can see if you're looking on the map and also on the demography of Syria, they have a lot of different groups. So when they were created, one of these new countries that were created after the First World War, they created Syria and they said, now all of you are Syria, you need now to live together. And for many years, they had a lot of instability, a lot of military coup and revolution you can see all over the years, until the Ba'ath came, especially Assad, 1970, and then it's a very stable, but also harsh and brutal regime, dictatorship, also representing a very small part of Syria, the Alawite. And then we saw in the Arab Spring 2011, when it started all over the Middle East, the protests, it started also in Syria. And we saw wide protests all over Syria. And many people thought that like Gaddafi and Mubarak and Saddam Hussein, also Assad, Bashar al-Assad will be next. But it didn't happen because at some point you had Russia and Iran decided that this is too important for them to lose. So they came and actually saved Bashar al-Assad. And then we had like a frozen conflict that you have Assad regime control most of Syria, the Kurds at some point, and then we have other rebel organization, the HTS. This is the main organization that eventually we heard in the news. We saw maybe the interview with Jolani in the CNN. So he's the head of HTS, but it was frozen. And until last week, suddenly it was a big surprise. People say that it's like the 7th of October for Syria. Everybody was very surprised of it. And I think they didn't believe that it would happen so fast because it really lasted for so long. But they were able to really get control until getting eventually to Damascus. And as we know, Assad left. But I think it's really also complicated to know what will happen. Also looking on the Israeli perspective, on the one hand, we know that Assad regime was an important part of this coalition of Iran together with Hezbollah because all the weapons to Hezbollah came to Syria. So that was an important part of it. And now it's getting out of it and also taking out trying to expel the Iranian from there. So that was one aspect. But on the other hand, first, we don't know what will happen there. We saw in many other cases in the Middle East that taking out Gaddafi or in Libya or in Yemen, that it created a vacuum that created a lot of instability. So even though it's really good that you are getting that for the Syrian, that this is the end of this terrible regime, that really the brutality that's even more than other dictatorship, it's the end, but we still don't know what will happen, and also what will be the structure of Syria, if the different rebels will be able to create something together, or if it will be just another, and one of the organizations will just control the other. Especially if we are talking about different minorities. We have Christians, we have the Druze, we have the Kurds. The idea of federation is, of course, something that the UN and others are talking about a lot. I'm not sure if the different rebels will agree to that, even though some of them are talking about the idea of decentralization. Yeah.
I can suggest in the Swiss method, cantons,
exactly.
It will be amazing. And then they will have an Alawi canton and a Sunni canton. Okay, so we started with today. Let's go back to 1 month ago. Donald Trump was re-elected. How do you think this will affect peace, if we can say peace? And also we have to mention that Trump is the person behind the Abraham Accords, which is somewhat of a change for Israeli peace agreement or for the neighborhood. So how do you think this will affect?
Yeah, so first I have a colleague here, Dana Landa, that we wrote together an article about Trump policy in the Middle East in the first term. So actually we followed that very, very closely. First, we need to say that Trump is a wild card. I'm trying not to predict anything, but specifically about Trump, very unpredictable, and it can change his policy about many issues in the same year. So we saw that in the first term. Always you can see North Korea as a good example, started with threatening to bomb them, and then moving to reconciliation and sending love letters to the leaders. So it can change a lot. Also with Iran, we saw some changes. So also here, I think it's difficult to predict. In the first term, I think in the Israeli-Palestinian context, he didn't achieve eventually nothing. He was talking a lot about the deal of the century, if you remember, that he will be the one to bring the deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But eventually, because he did a few steps about the settlement, about Jerusalem, you all remember, it created a rift between him and Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority. So he lost his ability to be the mediator because of that. So actually, eventually, the deal of the century was between him and Israel. So there was no the other part. So nothing came out of it. That's why he went to the Abraham Accord, to try to reach at least something with the Gulf state, but without the Palestinians. What will happen now? Again, it's very difficult to see, but we can see that some things change. First of all, we can see that he's talking a lot about it. In the campaign, I will bring peace to the Middle East. I will end the war. He said that a lot. Attacking Biden for the war, he said, I will end the war. And also you can see that also about, now he's talking about, it's already putting some pressure. And he recovered the relation with Abu Mazen. We already saw that they exchange letters, they talk, so we can see the relation with Ramallah improved. I know about different Palestinians that are in contact with the Trump administration, so maybe there is a change here. And also they have a very good relation with the Gulf states, especially with the Saudis. The Saudis even prefer Trump on Democrats, so they have some kind of joint thinking in many aspects. And also, we need to remember that he has a good relationship with Netanyahu, but it ended in a crisis. He said a few nasty words on Netanyahu, and now they are in good relationship, but he can put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu that Biden couldn't because of this partnership. So I think he had some tools that he can use. If he wants, we still don't know. What I think is interesting to see what will be in his administration, because we can see different types of people. We have Kushner, that was in the first term and probably is coming back from one side of the family. But I don't know if you heard, there is a Masad Bulus, that he is actually the father of, his son got married to Tiffany Trump, the daughter of Trump. So now he's part of the family, and he's going to be the senior advisor of Trump to the Middle East. So we have one part of the family, Kushner, we have one side, Masad Bulus. So the family of, this is how it will reshape the Middle East. But that will be interesting to see the dynamic between them. And Bulus already said that they are going to talk about a path to a Palestinian state, and he's an advisor of Trump. But we also have the ambassador to Israel that was nominated, Mike Huckabee, that he is more right-wing than Netanyahu. He will push for annexation, he will push for settlement, he wanted to move to a settlement. So this dynamic between these people will be interesting, and of course Trump will decide. And we saw this dynamic also in the first term, that the ambassador Friedman was pushing for annexation, Kushner pushing for normalization, and eventually we had a normalization. So it will be interesting, and we can see, and there is also the argument that he really wants a Peace Nobel Prize. That's something that we heard a lot from the Trump people. This is a dream. By the way, even if he will bring an agreement, I don't think the Peace Nobel Prize will give it to him.
I'm willing to give, if he brings peace, I'm willing to give him even the scientific Nobel Prize for economy, or I don't know, medicine. Okay, we're going again a bit backwards. October 7th, worst day of many people. How did this change? You know, if even before, peace was not a theme, not even in Israeli songs. And then afterwards, you know, we have all those people who are rethinking their peaceful thoughts or wishes. It was a big crisis, and still is, to the peace camp of Israel in many reasons. Also, like theoretically and on the ground, you know, many of the peace activists died, kidnapped, and even if, you know. So how will this affect, or sometimes from a crisis comes out something, you know, as Leonard Cohen sings, from the crack, a ray of sun could come. Do you think we are in this kind of a moment, or we still have way down to go?
First, in general, as I mentioned, there was no peace discourse, as we all know, in the last years. And both of us from the Oslo generation, and when we were kids, everybody was talking just about the peace process. That was what we saw in the news. and we saw Israelis and Palestinian leaders meet all the time. And I always say that I see the gaps with my students, that they have no idea when I'm talking about Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. They have never seen something about it. It's not, they can relate to that. So I think there is some problem of political imagination, even to think about it. They just saw the Abraham Accord, but nothing, they just know about Hamas, so they don't understand or comprehend how we can have something that is peacemaking. And again, it's not part of the discourse, not coalition, not opposition, not in the election campaign, no discussion about the long term, just tactical issues. And the influence of October 7, I think it's really too soon. I think we are still in the event, we have the hostages, we're still not at the end of it. And I think it will be one of the most dramatic events that will change the whole Israeli society, all Israel. Like we saw in 73 war, that changed the Israeli society, and I think it will take years for us to understand the implication in so many levels. So it's too soon. So everybody will say, this is the conclusion, I think it's too soon. But what we can see also from some surveys and discourse, that we actually can see two contradicting conclusion on this conflict. That one is saying, of course, there is no chance. Maybe in the past we thought about it, now there is no chance for peace. We lost the ability, they were animals, and after we saw what happened, we can never trust them. We can never be naive to think about it. So that's something that you can hear a lot. But at the same time, you can also see conclusion that the idea of conflict management was not working. The idea of just, let's avoid the conflict, let's not talk about the conflict, it's not really important, we'll just talk about other issues, was not working. And there was a survey of someone from the Hebrew University that 65% of the Israelis say that resolving the conflict now is the most urgent issue. And we did a lot of surveys also in a think tank I was working. It was always very, very low priority, the Israeli-Palestinian topic. It's not important. So I think something also changed in this perspective. And it could be, again, the same people believe on the same thing, that maybe we can think something immediately, but in the long term we realize, I also can see it with my students, they know that this is a topic we need to address. And we need to think about also long term, not just the military aspect. If you are not turning the military into a political agreement or a political change, there is no point of it.
Yeah. This will be my last question for this round, and then we'll open it up for the crowd. I'm sure you're very curious and you have many questions. I think it's the most relevant question for this kind of crowd. What do you think foreigners that are not Israelis or Palestinians, whether Jews, Muslims, Christians, could do in order to help us solve this conflict and not just cheer, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, just really get on the ground and help us solve our problems?
Yeah, so good question. So I can say that I was working in a think tank in recent years, dealing a lot with international engagement in conflict, what the international community, international actors can do. And we can see, because I'm dealing with different conflict areas, that eventually you need the help, you need the assistance for international engagement. You need the leadership, of course, the local leaders, but I always have colleagues from Northern Ireland telling me we couldn't have done it without the international actors that help us. Eventually you need the assistance. In the recent years, there was not a lot of international engagement. They got tired, it seems that it's not working, so they saw no real initiative in the last years. Maybe it will change. If I'm thinking about the role of the world or the international actors, we always liked in peace studies to talk about the bottom up and the top down. Like first we need to think about the high level diplomacy, the international actors, like regional actors, what they can do. And I think that here we have international actors, US, European countries, together with regional actors can do a lot. And I'm always think about the day after Yom Kippur, because I'm teaching a courses about the history of the diplomatic efforts. And during the last year, I was thinking a lot about what happened after 73, when you saw the US engagement, first with Kissinger, then with Carter, that actually took the parties, you said how to use the crisis as an opportunity, actually took the parties out of this terrible war. That was, I think, one of the biggest trauma until October 7, but actually took the parties, they realized that now we need to change, not continue with this war every 2 years, let's do something else. But it was with their help, giving incentive, giving guarantees, giving commitments. Kissinger almost lived in the Middle East for 2 years. So we need also these resources. But what is also important to have a cooperation with regional actors, that I think that can be a game changer. They are already in the region, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, that can play a part, not like the Abraham Accord that we are doing bypass the Palestinian, actually using them to promote peace with the Palestinian. And I would say about more the bottom-up and the grassroots level, I think that what is important, you said about promoting Israel, talking about Israel, Palestine, it's like, we also said like a football match. Like you need to decide in which side are you. And we need to create a space that is talking more in a constructive way about what can be done for both sides and talking about peacemaking and also creating more and more contacts between the sides and also peace-building project. Again, I mentioned Northern Ireland. During the 90s, already even before, there was a lot of projects that the European Union and others were doing, that the children will meet, that people will meet, that even though there was still not the peace process, at least to prepare the public. And there was a lot of projects about it, even though at the beginning there was no legitimacy to do that. But some people say that then when we had the peace agreement and there was a referendum and there was a high-level support, part of it was because of this growth level and peace-building project that took time to do. So you need to work at the same time, both you need, of course, the high-level diplomacy, it cannot work without it, but you also need to have these spaces that people can meet one another. And now it's almost not legitimate to talk about this thing in Israel, in Palestinian side, in the world. You have all the other voices. So I think that's what we need to create more and more spaces that dealing with this kind of discourse.
Switzerland sounds like the perfect place to do that. Any questions from the crowd, please? So the question is, would peace be possible with the current leaders on both sides that aren't very keen on any peace process? Okay.
First, I would say that I'm not saying that I'm optimistic. I must say that I use it as one model. We have a theory in conflict resolution called the ripeness theory that is saying that sometimes the parties need to feel in a mutual hurt and stalemate in order to move from conflict to conflict resolution. This is Professor Zartman theory. And then you feel that you have a way out. So sometimes the parties need to feel painful, that the status quo is not good for them, and then they can look for other options. So many people use 73. By the way, I mentioned that I'm teaching the course. In 71, Sadat already talked about peace, and Golda, Prime Minister, she didn't have this ripeness, so she was not ready. So only after 73, we considered both parties, and even then it took a few years. It was step by step. They had two agreements, and only then. But I agree with you that the problem of the leadership, and this is maybe even a global problem, it's the biggest problem that we have. And you can see Rabin and Hussein, you can see the peace agreement with Jordan without understanding the leaders. You can see peace with Egypt without seeing the importance of the leaders, even Oslo, and also in other Northern Ireland, South Africa, other places. So, and we don't have it. So this is a big problem. And then the question is what we can do when we don't have the leaders, if we can just give up or... So I think here you need at least to, what I think Kissinger was actually doing with all the problems, Kissinger, by the way, was actually first to create the vision, that we couldn't see that, to at least to create this vision even for the people. And when we have UN Resolution 242, I mentioned that. That was something that the world was saying, we know we are not ready, but this is what we suggest. This is a vision for the future. I think that was important. And then we can also have a pressure to do it, but in a gradual process. Like taking them like children hand in hand, but to do this step by step. But I agree with you that we have, in IR, we always talk about the three levels, the leaders, the societies, and the international system, and we have problem in all of them. The leaders, not interested and not legitimate. The societies, they have a lot of internal division. Israeli society has a division, Palestinian society has a division, also going to a more extreme direction in recent years. And the international world is full with many other urgent problems, and also all of the global conflict that the superpower cannot work together. So we don't have everything we had in the 90s, that we have all of the three, check. Now we don't have it. But I still believe that you still, if with strong leadership, international leadership, again, you can show the vision and start like a roadmap to go there, and you can't just wait until another Sadat or another Begin or something like that will happen.
The question is about minorities, what you call the peace spoilers, and what do you think governments could do in order to ease their effect on peace processes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first, the problem with Oslo was that there was no end game. So there was a process, and if you are doing a process and say in 5 years we will talk about the end game, you're actually asking the spoilers, you have the opportunity now to destroy it, because then we're going to talk about the end game. So we're actually giving incentive for the spoilers to work because there is still not a peace agreement. If there will be a peace agreement, it will be more difficult for them. But if you're saying this is just temporary, we'll see if it works, it's actually just giving them incentive. What we saw, my main example I know about Northern Ireland, that we saw also there that you have the most important leaders on both sides, on the different parts of the society, but you still have the Sinn Féin, the political part of the IRA, that eventually got into the process, Jerry Adams, Matty McGuinness, completely part of the process, leading the process, but then you have faction in the IRA created the real IRA, and they're completely against it. And they were, even one of the worst terrorist attacks that happened in Northern Ireland was in '98, during the peak moment of the peace process. But actually what's happened there was completely the opposite of Israel-Palestinian conflict. It actually united everybody against the spoilers and to say, you see, that's why we need to have peace in order to fight against them. But you have enough, what we call a strong coalition, to show that we are fight against them. And I think it was not in the case of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it was not such a small minority. On both sides, there was actually, it seems like a half-half. So it was very difficult, and the main challenge is how you can create to bring the other actors on both sides to make what now we have a lot of discussion on inclusive peace process. How you can bring Hamas and settlers to be part, if it's possible or not. What we also saw in Northern Ireland, that a very similar agreement was in the 70s, a very similar agreement, but it completely failed, and they went back to the conflict. And 20 years after that, they came to a very similar agreement, again, power sharing, and some people, they called it Sunningdale, the first agreement. And then they called the second agreement Sunningdale for Dummies, because it took some people 20 years to realize that now they need to join. The main thing was that they took a few actors that are more extreme joining this process. But the question is how to do it. So it's maybe not the formula, it's more how to take actors and to convince them that they need to be part of it. I don't know if it's possible and how, yeah.
The question is regarding the ICC and whether it is somewhat anti-Semitic, or is it true, or and how helpful it is, and in general, ICC regarding the peace process.
Yeah, so I can also say that I'm not an expert on legal matters. We have a very good expert in my department that I'm not dealing with the ICC and ICJ, even though I think it's an important part of the conflict, and I think it's getting more and more engaged in the conflict and have influence in conflict and conflict resolution. What I can say is the connection that I see between the stalemate in the peace process and the legal procedures. And we actually did some studies that actually show that once you had the stalemate in the peace process and the peace process collapsed, you will see more and more discussion about ICC and the sanction, because the world's saying, you can see that it's not working, the parties are not trying to deal with it. That's why we need to deal with other options like sanction or like legal matter, even before October 7. And I can also add, I mentioned the last initiative was Kerry Initiative, 2013. It brought the parties to negotiate peace. And one of the conditions for this negotiation was that the Palestinians are not going to join different international organizations, including the ICC. So that you are not and Israel need to do other things, releasing prisoners and so on. That was the precondition for the process. So during this time, the Palestinians actually did not do it, only after it collapsed. So I think that part of the idea was, first we'll try this idea of peacemaking, only after it fell and we got into a stalemate, it moved to different legal front and legal tools. So I think also there is a question here of how you can balance between the political ideas, how to change the reality. If you don't do it, it will move to other legal fights and legal struggles.
The question is regarding the separation between the West Bank and Gaza and different mentalities, different leaderships.
Yeah. So first I will say that the whole idea, even before Oslo, the Intifada was both Gaza and the West Bank. They always see themselves as one people, one entity. Also part of Oslo is the idea that this is one entity. It's really an important part of Oslo. Only later on it created this rift. Now, by the way, this election, both of them took place both in the West Bank and Gaza. So the election, when Abu Mazen was elected, he was elected in the election in West Bank and in Gaza. East Jerusalem, by the way, is more complicated. They have seats, but it's more complicated, but they also representation for East Jerusalem. And then also when Hamas won, it was an election in both West Bank and Gaza. By the way, I don't want to get into the details, but it's also about the electoral system. that they did, half of it was proportional, like you vote Fatah, you vote Hamas, and half of it is according to region. And Hamas won mainly because of the areas, the zones, because they're much more, Fatah had a lot of candidates running against one another because they are very divided. Hamas knew how to work very good to make sure that they will win most of it. So eventually they won mainly because of the system. That's why, by the way, immediately after the election, Abu Mazen changed the system, that it's only proportional. So this is just a small detail. Now, since then, 2007, when Hamas really took over of Gaza, it really created this situation that you really have this separation between two parts and two different governments, two different leadership, and it's something that was a real obstacle for the process. And when Abu Mazen was negotiating with Olmert, many people said, okay, we will have a peace. And Abu Mazen was still strong, by the way, at that moment. He was just elected, even though he lost Gaza. But people always said, like, okay, we are going to do peace with you. What about Gaza? So we are going to have just half peace. Abu Mazen always said, this is a rebel area. This is how we define it. It's part of us. We will go back to that. Let's make a peace agreement. And when we will be able to implement it in Gaza, we will do it. But until then, it will be Israel and the West Bank. And one day, we will be able to oppress this rebel and go back together. And it brings us back to the question of the day after, if to bring the Palestinian Authority back to the Gaza Strip, what most of the international community is saying, but many in the Israeli government is against it. The security establishment is supporting it. So this is also the question, if now the Palestinian Authority will go back to Gaza, and this is the question of the day after. Yeah.
I'll repeat the question. The question is, what will Lior say to an imaginary BDS supporter?
In general, I can say that because again, I'm a peace scholar, I always believe in dialogue and engagement. We know the problem of BDS. There is a conferences that I'm going every year, and there is always the fear that if there will be BDS, I will not allow to go there. And we always say we have a peace scholars, very famous in our department, that wrote a letter to some of the associations, said, we are the peace scholar of Israel. If you're not willing to talk with us, so with whom you're going to talk, with who you're going to encourage, and eventually, if the goal is to end the conflict, if this is the goal, if there is other goal, I don't know. So eventually, I believe that, again, talking about the diaspora, I wrote the book about the unofficial peace diplomacy, different types of private actors that can promote peace. And I have wrote journalists and different types of intellectual and so on. And I also worked about people in the diaspora. We had Nahum Goldman, for example, that was for the World Congress in the US. And he was meeting with different leaders in Morocco, and he went to Egypt. So we can see that also in the case of Northern Ireland, by the way, the diaspora in the US played an important role pushing the peace process, creating the contact between the Sinn Féin and Clinton, for example. So actually, again, I'm not giving advice and it's not my expertise, I believe that actually the goal of the diaspora is more to promote this kind of direction, or first to create this discourse and engagement about to change direction. It's not a football match. It's more of how we can resolve it and how we can create peacemaking to make a structural change in the situation.
I can add, as a Haaretz representative, we need partners. We feel like we are getting, shrinking the peace camp in Israel, if we can call ourselves like that. So we need partners, and BDS is not a partner in a way, or doesn't see us as partners. So yeah, partnership is super important. And I want to ask you last question. I think it will be somewhat optimistic, especially for the crowd here, that they don't know that you teach in the university, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, you teach both Palestinians and Israelis. Some are from East Jerusalem, some are from the West Bank even, they're coming, right? If I'm not mistaken. And they are all sitting in the same class, studying about conflict, about their own conflict, and it's actually going quite well, even after October 7th. Can you please describe a bit about that?
Yeah, so I can say that after October 7, it took a few months until we came back to study because of the war, because everything was going on. So it took a while, and we were all in shock, and it took a few months. And then I think maybe in January, something like that started. And during this time, we had a lot of discussion of what will happen. Like, it seems that this is an earthquake. We had no idea what will happen. And the idea of coming back to the campus, and again, we have Israelis and Palestinians, we have more and more Palestinians from East Jerusalem in the Hebrew University, especially since we have the fence, the barrier between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So it's more easier for them to go to the Hebrew University to get a job in Jerusalem than to go to Birzeit and Ramallah. So we see, and the Hebrew University is actually doing a year for them because some of them are doing the Palestinian, Jordanian textbook. So they need to do a process in order to get to the Hebrew University. But you can see more and more, 25%. Even I compare to when I was a student, now I can see there are more and more students. And we had a lot of concerns and a lot of discussion. And we did some workshop about teaching and doing the war. I always remember that one of the first thing they said, try not to talk about the conflict at the beginning. And then I raised my hand, I'm teaching about the conflict. It could be challenging not to talk about the conflict. And they said, so we will do a special workshop for you. But yeah, I can say that actually this workshop just made me even more concerned. And I think that eventually it really went well, also especially comparing to other campuses around the world. I don't know to explain how, but what the main thing I feel, and again, I'm teaching the conflict and peacemaking. It's not other topic, this is the topics. I really felt that the students really want to know. Even though it's sensitive, and I really afraid also the word I'm using, I'm always with the Palestinian, with the religious, that I'm saying everything, I'm not saying any word that will, but still saying everything, but being careful. I felt, again, because of the word, that people feel that this is something that we don't know enough. Maybe people even tell me, we feel that we are not allowed to talk about it. One student told me after the class, we feel like it's a taboo, we shouldn't talk about it. So I really feel part of even a mission of doing that. And I feel that the students want to know. It's not that I'm forcing them, it's all, they can choose other courses. But I feel that because of the situation, they realize how much is important to know. They can decide then whatever they want and what to do and everything, but at least to know about this field. Yeah.
It's very nice. Thank you so much, Dr. Lior Lehrs.
Thank you, Netta.
From the Hebrew University. Thank you for coming, for caring, for really being curious about the conflict and hopefully peace. Thank you, Nadia and the Hebrew University. Thank you, Edna. Thank you over there, the technical team. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.